Karin, last time I spoke to you, it was in 2021, and you were running as a candidate representing the People's Party of Canada. Tell us a little bit about what you've been up to since then. You're now running as a candidate for the BC Conservatives. How did that come about?
Well, it's a good question. So as I've connected with different political groups, I've always found people who are involved in the BC Conservatives, or the Conservative Party of BC, as is the official name, and so I've been aware that it's a growing group and really an expanding tent, I think, is the terminology I kind of like. That more and more people are finding that, the uni program in BC is just not allowing for any debate, any discussion, any questioning. I mean, you know the drill. So I've been aware that there's sort of political energy moving there. And then once John Rustad moved over from having been, he got, I guess, as you know, booted out of the Liberal caucus for opposing the in this case it was the climate orthodoxy, and then he, I guess, came to the same conclusion I had, which was that this is where the political energy and the appetite for sort of more dynamic political discussion is gathering. And so I was going to sort of take another, I saw the provincial election coming for next year, and I was sort of going to think about it a little more over the ensuing year. But then Melanie Mark stepped down in Vancouver Mount Pleasant, and a by-election was on the horizon. I thought, well, I'm going to make a decision. It better be now. So I was, a number of people actually suggested that I join and that I consider running under the banner, and it's overall been a good experience overall. Interesting people, this is where the diversity is. It's very weird.
It is weird. As I think you know, I grew up as like a hardcore NDP supporter. My family, my dad was a member of the NDP party. He volunteered for them. We voted for them in every provincial and federal election. And over, a little, probably 3 or 4 years now, at least, I've definitely moved away from the NDP. And then, interestingly, have found that the Conservative Party of Canada, in any case, I haven't actually, unfortunately, paid too much attention to the provincial Conservatives of BC, but I hope to learn more about the party today, of course. That has become the party that I would be willing to vote for. It's like the only party that's speaking to some of my concerns, not all of them, but I don't feel like I can expect everything from a mainstream party. I'm curious, do you identify as conservative? What's your kind of political history?
Well, like you, I grew up NDP, and I actually volunteered for several NDP election campaigns. I worked on the Betty Baxter campaign in Vancouver Centre in, I think, 1991. And I volunteered for both Libby Davies and for Jenny Kwan in this riding. But I guess it was probably almost concurrently that I was getting more and more involved in education politics. And I happened into a situation where there was a battle in my kids' school about literacy programs. And basically there was the status quo in which sort of, I don't know, a good 50% of the kids were not reading on grade level, or were not learning to read in grade 1, which is really the key to success. Mm-hmm. And then there was this new program that some of the teachers had found because they were frustrated. They thought these kids can do better we should be getting better results. They're not, these kids are not somehow destined to fail. We should be doing better. They found this new program. They brought it in, and it was super successful with this group of inner city kids. And then I just happened to bring my kids to that school just before the first year that they did this program. And so it was like stumbling into a live, perfectly controlled experiment, because one of the grade 1 teachers did not do the program. One of the grade 1 teachers did. And then the school decided whether to keep the program or not. And they did. And then I just watched the response to this program of sort of the school, the staff in the school themselves, the district, the Ministry of Education, the union. And I was stunned to find that especially the union really didn't want this successful program. And collectively, the education establishment and it was an NDP government at the time, provincially. It was, and of course the union is always NDP. And I can't remember what the school board was at that time, but I think it was overwhelmingly COPE or something. And yeah, so they just nibbled away at this program until it kind of buckled. That every time the school, it was a small school, so every time the school had to send us a new principal, they would send one who had like a mission to get rid of this program. And just little things. It was really amazing that it was all the left was fighting to keep these kids failing. And that was really the first schism that I had, because my dad was a teacher, and I remember him talking about, he taught shop in high school. And so he always got the kids that were falling off the bottom of sort of the academic spectrum, who would take the shop classes. And he, so I had a sensitivity built in about these kids. And when I saw that, this program was successful with kids that had been written off up until that point, I thought, my God, how lucky to be sitting ringside when this is discovered, how you can effectively teach all these kids. And then to watch the NDP just whittle it away. I mean, I was just, I was, that was a serious blow for me in terms of my beliefs, my political belief system. And ultimately, in dealing with various school board members, I realized that the people on the right wing, who I had thought were just like, as an NDPer, you just think these are uncaring, horrible people who would, like, if they could, they would, I don't know, cast these children aside or something. No, they actually cared more and more sincerely for those kids than any of the left wing school board members, union people, ministry people. So yeah, that was my schism. And it kind of, it's, so identify as a conservative. I never thought I'd see the day, never. But ultimately you have to accede to reality if you're actually trying to achieve some good in the world.
Right. And and I've had a similar experience to you. Many people I know have had this experience as well, where we've found ourselves, cast onto the other side of the political spectrum. But, I, like you, grew up believing that right-wing people, conservatives, whatever you want to label them, were just like uncaring, selfish, mean people. They don't care about the homeless. They don't care about equality. They want to cast aside the marginalized, the underlings, etc. And that's not a fair representation at all. It's mostly untrue. Everyone's an individual, and I think that in general, subscribing to party politics and putting people in these kinds of categories is pretty unhelpful. But what we've seen in terms of the debate, let's call it, around gender identity ideology, is that for the most part, it's been conservatives and the right who've come out in support of kids and families. And I'm really grateful. I just saw today that there was a protest in Ottawa, and it was Muslim families who were pushing back against the pride messaging in schools. And I find it really interesting, in part because I wonder how Justin Trudeau is going to manage to spin this as like a Nazi white supremacist process of bigots.
Yeah. It has gone across the political spectrum, or across the, I should say, almost the, it's moved through various communities, to the ones that he thinks are on his side. Yeah. And the frustrating thing to me is that, there have been so many protests that have been discounted and ridiculed and put down. And it's actually kind of frustrating, and kind of telling that the previous voices have never been heard. So it will be very interesting to see if anybody in the sort of inside ranks, whether at the school board level or the federal level, starts actually taking it seriously, coming from Muslims and people that they are used to considering their constituents.
Right. I mean, the government and mainstream media, which generally toes the literal party line, in terms of government ideology, policy, so on and so forth, have really worked very hard to frame this gender identity debate as left versus right, which was really frustrating to me as somebody who was a socialist and who identified as a socialist and a feminist when I first started speaking out about this stuff. But I mean, I'm curious to know how you got involved in this issue, because I remember, when I talked to you in 2021, I think you were probably the only candidate, like the only politician I could think of in Canada. And luckily you were in Vancouver. I mean, that was a real fluke. But, because sometimes we get some people speaking out in like Alberta, but not in BC. Definitely not in Vancouver. And you were speaking out against gender identity ideology. You were speaking out against the COVID mandates and lockdowns. And I was so excited to encounter you. But I'm curious how you first started getting involved in and concerned about the gender identity issue.
It's kind of complicated. I mean, I have to preface it probably by saying that I have a science-based education. I used to be a dietitian, so my undergrad degree is in, it was a Bachelor of Home Economics, believe it or not, but it's basically in nutritional science. And so I knew how to read scientific literature. And when I got involved in this literacy debate, or in what are called the reading wars, actually, because as I discovered later, they've been going on for 100 years. I was quickly able to distinguish the sort of, the ideology from the actual evidence-based work. And there is not a lot of evidence-based work in education. And concurrently with the literacy program, the reading program that came into my kids' school, they brought in these anti-bullying programs. And when I looked at, and what they did was they brought them in the form of studies. They sent home these notices saying, oh, you can be in this exciting study. We'll have a pizza. You'll get pizza if you sign your kid up for this program. And that was like my first red flag. I was like, wait a minute. That's not how you recruit for a study. And so I looked at the stuff, the kind of academic work that was backing up these anti-bullying programs. And I just went, this is garbage. This is just somebody's stupid idea about how kids are going to get along better. And somehow or another, they've finagled their way into the school, and they've got the school board or the principal or the superintendent's attention, and they're just waltzing in there with their stupid ideas. And I just watched these programs. I mean, the kids' behavior actually deteriorated as these programs came into the school. Wow. It was just ridiculous. So then the anti-bullying programs really quickly started to be about gay kids. And I don't know if you remember that there were these legal cases about gay books in schools. And so the premise, the anti-bullying programs actually became the premise on which they were bringing instruction about homosexuality into the classrooms, on the premise that gay kids or kids of gay parents were being bullied more, and that these programs were needed kind of to improve on that. And again, that didn't necessarily tally with what I was seeing or what I thought the data on bullying showed. So, and then the transgender thing kind of popped into view, 2015, 2016, I think my kids were actually already out of school by that time. And as it became a big thing, and I think one of the first, because I'd gotten involved in sort of various legal projects that I think I've bored you with talking about before. And so I was quite conscious of the AB versus CD case, the one where a child who wanted to go through, a girl who wanted to go through a so-called transition, her father objected, and so the hospital basically, he tried to sue the hospital because they invoked the Infants Act so that his daughter could give her own consent. I was very aware of that case and the fact that it grew out of, I would track that case really carefully, and was aware that it had grown out of this child's exposure to the so-called the Soji curriculum at school, because her school was a test site for that program, and she was very quickly drawn into it. So, and then as I sat in court listening to the case, it sort of dawned on me suddenly that I'd been on the sidelines the whole time this thing was growing. Like, I hadn't even made that connection of anti-bullying to the homosexual education to the transgenderism. I hadn't really drawn the line really until I watched that court case. And I suddenly realized, God, I have more history on this topic than most people do in terms of how this is being promoted through the schools. And just to sort of segue a little bit into what I'm doing now, and what we've made a plank in the platform for this by-election. I'm also a former athlete, so I did sports from a very young age till, I don't even know. I mean, I still cycle, which is, but certainly not competitively anymore. But I've been in sports for a long time, and so that's been a strong interest. So somehow or another, my long-term, all the things I've been through somehow seem to converge on this topic in so many ways. Also, as a former dietitian, as I've watched the health care professions falling into the belief system, I'm fairly familiar with professional standards of practice, and I've, again, just been stunned at the ease with which these professions are giving up their standards and just going along and actually harming these kids.
It's amazing because the people who should know better, who are obligated, doctors, for example, to first do no harm, are going right along with this. There's so little pushback. The teacher situation, I mean, I unfortunately have lost a lot of respect for teachers. This probably began when I was in high school and I hated all my teachers. But it's certainly grown, my level of disrespect for teachers, as I've seen them promote gender identity, ideology, and all this pride, LGBTQ plus whatever, in schools. and treat parents and kids who question or don't want to go along as these horrible bigots. They're so self-important. And I sort of wonder if this is like a new thing, because I feel like in the past, teachers had a lot more humility. Teachers seem to believe themselves to be political entities, and they feel proud when they're imposing their politics and their ideologies on kids. They feel righteous. They feel entitled to do so.
It's tough. There are a number of factors. First of all, I wouldn't say that, there's always been a tension between teachers and families, let's say. I was actually just telling somebody this story on the weekend. There's a very tragic story from the 1970s about a little girl named Kimmy Thompson, I think, in Calgary, which really captures for me the difficulty that the urge that teachers have increasingly to help raise kids, because it comes out of the pedagogy that is like the learning theory about that, where education is about the whole child. And that actually dates back in sort of hundreds of years to people who were running orphanages where actually there were no parents involved. A surprising amount of modern teaching methodology dates back to those theorists who tested their theories on in orphanage, like Pestalozzi, for example. And so he came up with these great ideas of how to raise the kids, but of course there were no parents involved. So when you have parents involved, there is an uneasy relationship as to who does what for the child, and that's always been tense. And this this sad story of Kimmy was that she had just started kindergarten, and the teacher said to her mom, Kimmy is just far too clingy and dependent. You have to encourage her to be more independent. You should make her walk to school by herself. And the mom, inexplicably, and even in her own later writings about this, she couldn't explain why she had allowed the teacher to talk her into this, but she did send her little kindergarten child to walk to school by herself. And of course something bad happened, and Kimmy didn't even make it to school her first day walking by herself. And it's sort of an important, I mention it because, first of all, because it illustrates the hazard of not sort of respecting where that line is. And of course it's being crossed, in spades right now, as teachers are encouraging kids to be themselves to the extent of, that first of all, the notion that their true self is somebody that their parents don't know. And secondly, even hiding, under school policies, actively hiding from parents that, there's this alter ego that their child has developed. It's a line, that has never been well defined, I think, is the point I'm trying to make. And it is being crossed, right now a lot.
Yeah. And I just noticed that the Premier of New Brunswick, Blaine Higgs, he just announced this week that parental consent would be required to essentially socially transition kids. So to change their pronouns at school or their names without telling their parents. I've not heard of any talk of any policies of this nature in any other provinces. I wonder, what's the policy in BC currently?
Those policies do exist in various school districts.
Okay.
And even where they don't, I think the teachers that you're referring to do take it upon themselves occasionally to function in that way.
You mean to secretly change the pronouns of the kids without telling their parents,
sort
or
of
that they are telling the parents?
Yeah. I mean, I think we have all heard accounts of that being done. And I know there are efforts being made to catalog where those policies are. I don't have that information in front of me, but there are school districts in BC that have them. The other thing I was going to say about the nature of teachers is that the recruitment to teacher education has also for a long time been focused on drawing in the people who are most likely, I think, to bring an ideology with them that they want to, that like they're teaching in order to promote their ideology. I think all the professions have been doing that. I mean, I remember seeing a UBC teacher education ad. Oh, it must be 20 years ago. That was something like, change the world, become a teacher. And so the idea was that you weren't teaching to help kids learn to read or do math or anything like that. You were being recruited to be a teacher so that you could promote your ideology.
Yeah.
Which, even at the time I found that a bit, without transgenderism on the radar, I found that a little bit, it was reaching a bit, I thought.
Yeah, it seems like the idea of what the job of being a teacher has changed quite a bit.
Yeah, and the job of being a parent has changed a lot too. Partly because, and ironically, in a direction where we are more dependent as parents on the schools. We have to trust them more because both parents are working. I'm not hearkening back to sort of say things should be the way that they used to be, but just a state of fact that when you have a parent at home while the kids are in school, you can keep kids home if there are things, if the child isn't happy, if the child's upset about something that's going on in school, whatever the reason, you can easily keep your kids home. But when both parents are working, then you can't keep the children home as easily. So you're trusting the system more at a time when the system is actually taking more license with the trust that we have for them.
Mm-hmm. The protest that I mentioned earlier in Ottawa, I believe was in response to this email that was sent out on May 31st. So the Ottawa School Board emailed all staff and outlined a new policy that is to take effect in September. And the policy states that in all classrooms, including kindergarten, the use of they, them pronouns should be used when referring to students until they specify their other pronouns that they prefer. Mm-hmm. And the email also said that LGBTQI plus identities and learning are to be the identities are to be embedded in the overall learning environment from kindergarten through grade 12, and that this is not open to debate or selective participation. And they specifically said that students weren't permitted to opt out, which I found strange because, as I believe, I'm under the impression that sex education, for example, there's always been opt-out options. Is that right?
That I don't know.
Or I shouldn't say always, but in the pretty recent past.
Even if there's not an official option, I'm sure there has always been opting out, that parents, especially if their kids don't want to do something, that the parents would make it possible for the child to stay home. So I don't know policy wise, and especially because it may have been board specific as this is. What I find interesting is as we I seem to remember that this particular school board I seem to remember seeing on Twitter that they had just hired like a diversity coordinator or something like that. And what has struck me about the people who build these kinds of programs and policies is that once they have these designated positions, they're they're not paid to be civil servants serving the public interest, as I think most of us expect that, say, a director of learning would be, or a director of reading instruction or something. They are basically people who have been hired not to change their minds about something. So not to find the best program for kids, but to impose this program. So if something like, let's say tomorrow, some absolutely irrefutable evidence emerges that the whole pronoun thing is really harming kids and confusing them in a very toxic way, and causing, a big part of causing the depression and anxiety that kids are feeling these days. If something emerged tomorrow that shows that irrefutably, somebody who has the title of diversity coordinator could not act on that information in the direction of benefiting kids, right? Because they'd be arguing themselves out of a job. It's really the direction in which the bureaucracy actually develops in order to foster the ideology. And then, the public then has no status when you have a bureaucracy that's designed like that. And in fact, I don't think elected officials do too. The school board officials, there must be a reason. There's thousands and thousands of school board officials across the country, school elected officials, school board trustees. And for some reason, they're going along with all this. And they're not all fans of it. They can't possibly be. And so there's an internal dynamic that develops that just makes everybody more distant from what the public actually expects of their schools, to favor kind of a staff-driven model of decision making. It's almost baked in that this kind of a policy would come up, that the public would object, and then the institution wouldn't be able to respond in a productive way.
I wonder if you have had any success in terms of pushing back or organizing any pushback against Soji in BC.
Well, certainly I'm not campaigning on Soji specifically. What we're saying as a party right now is that we're against any ideological indoctrination in schools, that schools should be focused on what they were originally designed for, which is equipping kids with the skills required to engage in adult life, in adult society in a productive way. And that, if you draw the full circle, the school is supposed to support the democratic process. So these kids should be able to read. They should be able to evaluate different options. They should know enough about public infrastructure and economic issues, that they should be able to evaluate the options on their ballot and then actually make it to the polls on voting day and cast their ballot. It's kind of a full circle thing. So actually mobilizing against Soji is not something that I'm doing at the moment. I know there are groups that have been doing it specifically, and I think it's not, again, it's one of those things where the Conservative Party of BC becomes the only alternative to this uni program, and the Soji curriculum is part of that. It's something that we will get in BC almost no matter who is elected to govern the province. Now, this is the by-election, so we're not running to govern. We're running for, a couple of seats in the legislature where we can speak to things in an effective way. But next year, we do hope to be fielding enough candidates to actually be a governance alternative. And in that case, that will become an option. But right now, we're just speaking out against ideological indoctrination in the schools at all.
Mm-hmm. And you're, of course, in a traditionally NDP riding. East Vancouver is an NDP riding. I lived in Vancouver, Kensington, for over 10 years, always NDP every time. How much success have you had in terms of breaking through? You know, have you been talking to people in your riding who are troubled by these kinds of ideologies and these NDP policies that we've been dealing with for many, many years now?
Definitely, yeah. There is a strong wave of objection to not only to the programs themselves, but to the fact that the NDP doesn't talk about controversial things. The NDP's program is the NDP's program, and it doesn't even matter. I mean, I experienced that myself in terms of the close alliance between the NDP and public sector unions. It's like, well, how well is this really serving the public? Well, the NDP doesn't really care. And I guess they feel that they're strong enough that they can shed a few voters without losing elections. I don't know. We'll see whether how strongly people feel and how many people feel that way enough to send a message.
Yeah. And so you're one of the few politicians. I don't know if there are any other candidates who have spoken out about the issue of saving women's sports, so preventing males from competing as females in sport. I'm curious to know, first of all, how you got involved in that issue and why you started fighting that, and if you've encountered any other politicians in BC who are interested in fighting this as well.
I think it's an issue that if you're not really involved in sport, you might not be hearing a lot about what's actually happening on playing fields and in competitions. And so I'm not sure. I mean, John Rustad, as the Conservative Party of BC leader, is certainly, not only does he know about it, but also he's interested in putting forward a motion or a private member's bill in the legislature to address it. So certainly I always, I'm definitely not the only one. There's definite support there. How did I first become aware? Yeah, I don't know. I guess if you just have your ear to the ground, you just start to hear this happening, that happening. And yeah, when something happens like the Will Thomas, Leah Thomas thing, and these incredibly brave athletes who are actually involved in the sport, talking frankly about their experiences. And they're not just talking about their opinions, they're talking about their actual experiences. And I think it is obviously taking a lot for them to come forward. It's actually easier for somebody like me to kind of talk on a policy level. But they're actually in the changing rooms, and they are actually in the pool. And I hugely respect what they're coming forward to do.
Yeah, me too. I mean, it's so risky for them to do this. They can lose their scholarships. They can lose their careers. They obviously are getting seriously attacked over this. Riley Gaines was mobbed when she tried to speak out in defense of women's rights in San Francisco. I have huge respect for these women also, because they're doing this almost alone. There's so much fear around this. I want to talk a little bit about your platform outside of these gender identity issues, and I'm interested particularly in your position on the addiction crisis and the homelessness crisis in BC. BC has taken a harm reduction approach that's really limited to harm reduction. So, it's like clean needles, clean drugs, and then hands off. And I read an article that you shared, actually, that you tweeted, that was was holding up Portugal's model as a defense of their approach. But in fact, their model is not Portugal's model. A lot of people talk about Portugal's model and how successful they've been in dealing with this addiction and overdose crisis. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about that model and what you're advocating for in terms of these issues.
So the issues of addiction and homelessness and crime are all, of course, intermingled. And the Mount Pleasant riding includes the downtown east side, and it includes Strathcona, which is close to the downtown east side, which is where I live also, and where we had a tent city setting up in Strathcona Park a couple of years ago, and so from the perspective of public safety, the party's position is basically that whatever the source of the threat, whether it's a plethora of mental health conditions, whether it's addiction, whether it's just actual criminality, or an intersection of those three, that the priority has to be public safety. And I think we've mm-hmm. The policies have so far really been wall-to-wall services for addicts in particular, thinking that if they are not as troubled, that somehow their addiction will resolve itself, or they'll choose treatment or something. I think those policies are made by people who don't understand addiction very well, and don't understand how addicts come to function after they've been on drugs for an extended period of time. So what Portugal's model does is exactly that. It foregrounds the issue of a functioning society without this constant, without allowing addicts to change the standards of normal behavior. And it really, if you look around and watch addicts, the sort of street population of addicts around here, it is astonishing how much utter human degradation there is. And I mean, you cannot, even if your primary empathy is for the addicts and not for, say, the families that are having their wagons stolen out of their front yards, so that somebody can net a couple of dollars for the next fix. Even if your focus is on the addicts, you cannot possibly persuade yourself that this level of human degradation is serving the addicts. It's simply, nobody wants to be that degraded. No. And you,
it's no way to live. It's totally dehumanizing. It's totally degrading, as you say.
It really is. And the intersection between the mental health and the addiction, it began when Riverview closed, and when a whole bunch of mentally ill people, it was a prediction at the time, they're all going to find their way to the downtown east side and become addicted to drugs. Well, that's what we've now got. And then we've got these people who is super complex to take care of them. But we should not feel that we are somehow unable to do that, or unworthy to do that, or that normal people should feel some shame about expecting that, there shouldn't be somebody walking through your yard at 3:00 in the morning stealing your shoes off your porch. Yeah. It should be okay to say, yeah, we would like a safe neighborhood. We should not live in a state of siege mentality.
Or that you don't want a tent city in your backyard. Like the tent city that was in Strathcona Park was in people's backyards.
Yeah.
Those were houses that were surrounding that park, that these people had to deal with this, horrifically dangerous, crime-ridden health hazard.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no.
And activists were advocating to keep. The activists were fighting the city and the police to allow them to stay there.
Yeah. That was, and it was not a safe environment. Again, if you care about addicts and you care about the homeless and you care about the mentally ill, you do not advocate for having them in that kind of an environment. if they have to be living in tents, they're a lot safer living in sort of scattered tents, sort of a little more on their own than in this, it was almost like
and Oppenheimer Park too, actually. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, the one prior to that. Yeah, these were not safe environments.
Yeah.
They were not safe for the people that they were supposed to be serving, much less for the people who lived around and nearby.
Yeah.
There were some serious assaults that took place, both within and on neighbors. It is intolerable. We have to be able to say it's intolerable, and we have to be able to take measures, even if they are not, optimally celebrating of the, the addicted population. We have to be able to take those measures. And when it comes to the actual commission of crime, John Rustad's idea is actually kind of interesting, because it's something that premiers are doing across the country for various things, is to invoke the notwithstanding clause. If the federal laws are not allowing, because criminality is a federal jurisdiction, crime is a federal jurisdiction. If federal laws are not allowing the province to provide a safe environment, then the province should invoke the notwithstanding clause to on whatever direction is actually required to create a safe environment where you can have flourishing families and a prosperous economy.
I mean, you hear from leftist activists, let's say, that, and I think from the NDP too, that these problems have to do with lack of access to housing. So people are being forced out onto the street. And I get the impression that that's not necessarily true, but I'm curious to know, I mean, obviously things like COVID had an enormous impact on the addiction crisis and the homelessness crisis and the overdose crisis. Does that have anything to do with Vancouver becoming like a practically unlivable city for people who are poor and working class?
Certainly, the issue of affordability is another one that we've put forward as part of our platform. But I think does wealth disparity in itself drive addiction? It's really hard to say. Often it's related, but I don't think it's disparity. It's that people are functioning in an economically viable fashion, and then something happens, like workplace injuries, or a huge trigger of addiction and often homelessness. But there are people on the street doing drugs who have choices around homes. They have family, they have places they could live if they were not addicted. Right. There's really, I think, a dearth of appetite just getting them off of getting them, inducing them to seek treatment. There's so much there. The housing. Well, one of the most interesting quotes I've come across, and I may have even cited it before, Jane Jacobs made the point that poverty has no causes. Only prosperity has causes. And it's a remarkably complex notion, in that, and I interpret it as saying that basically all of our default state is basically feral living. We're scraping a living out of the dirt, basically. But for certain things that we do, so that we have housing, so that we have a job, so that we have relationships. And this, I think, is highlighted by how easily something like a workplace injury can tip people over into from sort of what might be just a marginal state of living to into street living. Mm-hmm. The issue of extreme wealth, extreme wealth does coexist very uneasily with with ordinary and marginal citizenship, let's say. And we come to the question of, marketing our housing overseas and building more and more housing that we're marketing in a completely different economy where people are working with different currencies, different levels of wealth. There's certainly something that needs to be looked at in the issue of disparity. Those two extremes. I think they almost have to coexist because there always needs to be something to strive for. People need to see room to sort of reach another level of economic life. But I don't have an answer on the impact of how much more rich the ultra rich have gotten over just the past 3 years especially, but it's been going on. It's a trend that's been going on, I think, for several decades. I don't have a good answer for it, but I recognize that it's an issue that we should talk about.
Mm-hmm. And again, as I mentioned earlier, you were one of the few politicians who were speaking out. I mean, the People's Party of Canada was, for sure, in general, speaking out against the COVID lockdowns and the COVID mandates. What have you seen in terms of long-term impacts on BC residents as a result of these lockdowns and mandates? You know, what's happening? Is there something happening today? You know, have people been impacted negatively? Are they still being impacted negatively?
I absolutely. If nothing else, we're being impacted by the fact that there are still several thousand healthcare workers who are laid off because of mandates. And so, it's very much a provincial jurisdiction that we have a healthcare system that is seriously strained, and we're not bringing these workers back. And it is a party position that we favor bringing those workers back, by the way. I was also just told today about a report that has come out in Britain evaluating the effects of the mandates, which is quite damning. And I'm sorry I don't have a link for it, but I'll send it to you afterwards. Maybe you can post it, which is quite damning. And you may remember that we had an economist, I think his name was Douglas Allen, if I'm not mistaken, at SFU, who I think in 2021, maybe even earlier, warned that the lockdowns might be an absolutely disastrous public policy decision, the lockdown and mandate. And that's exactly what this report now concludes, that it was a serious, very serious policy error to have gone the mandatory route, partly because there's so much that people would have done on their own voluntarily. And so it wasn't as though, like, the mandates were made on some sort of a bizarre premise that if you didn't impose mandates, if you didn't have requirements, that nobody would do anything. You know, nobody would wear masks if masks were a good thing, that nobody would get vaccines if vaccines were a good thing. So that nobody would move to remote work or whatever it was. So there was this assumption that, you know, your default option was zero accommodation, zero reaction by the public. And so you had to get somehow to 100 miles an hour. And so you had to do that with all the force that the state could bring to bear.
Yeah. Yeah, there was actually a paper published by a guy named Kevin Bardosh who I interviewed last year, but he's published something in May about the COVID pandemic response and the harms on society that's quite good. That was out of University of Washington and the University of Edinburgh. I'll put it in the chat anyway. And then hopefully I'll try to find the other paper that you referenced. I'll let you go soon. I've kept you for almost an hour. I'm curious to know how people can support you in the by-elections
Thank you for asking. Yeah, it's a regrettable fact that campaigns do cost money, and so donations are always appreciated. The Conservative Party of BC website has a page for my campaign with the donate button on it, and contributions are hugely appreciated. We are currently, so we're currently trying to get one of our leaflets to every household in the riding, either by mailing it or with volunteer work. And so if anybody feels inclined to do that kind of work, we're also recruiting volunteers. And I can be contacted probably, I always have trouble. I don't like to ask people to learn how to spell my name, but
I have to look it up every single time.
I know.
I'm afraid.
Karin.Litzcke at conservativebc.ca. It's Karin and then Litzcke. If anybody wants to volunteer for the campaign, I'll put you through to the people who are coordinating that work. And I should say already that there's a whole bunch of really interesting people coming together to support this campaign. It's very much a team effort, and I appreciate their work hugely, and I'm really enjoying getting to know them.
And the by-elections are on June 24th? Is that right?
Final voting day is, whoops, I've just lost my picture. Hang on, there we go. Final voting day is June 24th, and there is advance voting. I believe it's June 16th to 21st. So if anybody's not going to be in town on voting day, there is plenty of opportunity to vote in advance.
Excellent. Thank you so much for talking with me today. Thank you so much for speaking out about all these issues. It's such a relief to me to see someone local. I'm unfortunately just barely not in your riding. I'm on the other side of 16th on Maine. I still have an apartment there. But yeah, I mean, close enough. And yeah, I'm so grateful that you're speaking out about this. It seems that the vast, vast, vast majority of politicians in Canada are scared to. So hopefully you'll inspire them to, start standing up and speaking out about these things.
Well, I will say that in the recent trustee elections, actually which were in several provinces last year, and certainly in BC, there were a lot of people who were running on a platform of challenge, let's say, and I cannot overemphasize how much it helps to have people joining political parties that are going the direction that they want to see, volunteering for the party even outside of a campaign period, and especially as provincial elections run up, of course, come up, because that's much more party oriented than municipal campaigns. But just, volunteer for campaigns, donate where you can. It makes a huge difference, because just speaking out by itself doesn't actually accomplish anywhere near as much as a successful campaign does.
Okay, that's great. Good to know. Okay. So good luck with your campaign. I totally support you.
Okay, thank you, Meghan, and thank you so much for having me. It's been good chatting again.
Okay, take care.
You too. Bye.